For most of my life, I believed loyalty was the purest form of love. If you stayed, gave sacrifice, then you were loved in return. That belief shattered the afternoon my parents looked at me, sitting in the living room of the house I had bought, and gently told me I should leave because my sister needed it more. My name was on every document. Every payment came from me. So, tell me, what would you do if the home you built suddenly wasn't yours anymore before there was a house? Before there were legal papers and quiet decisions, there was Boulder. Not the postcard version with the mountains and clean air. I remember the smaller house we grew up in. The one where everything started to feel just slightly uneven. Emma was the center of it all. She had this spark, at least that's what Mama always said. A kind of easy brightness that pulled attention toward her without effort. When she laughed, the whole room seemed to lean in. Dad would laugh louder than necessary at her jokes, even the ones that didn't quite land. Mom watched her the way people watch fireworks, waiting for the next burst. I was there too, just quieter. While Emma chose what we watched on TV, I was the one asked to check if the laundry was dry. While she told dramatic stories about school friends and who liked who, I cleared plates and wiped counters. It never felt cruel. No one yelled, no one insulted me. It was just the pattern. Emma talked. I helped. At dinner, she would describe outfits, dances, clubs she wanted to join. Mom's eyes followed her hands as she spoke. Dad leaned back in his chair, amused, engaged. When it was my turn, I'd talk about grades or saving money for college. The air shifted, not cold, just thinner. I learned early that attention was something you earned by being useful. So I became useful. I kept my grades perfect. I turned in assignments early. When I was 16, I got a part-time job at a diner. I came home smelling like coffee and fryer oil, my shoes sticky from long shifts. Mom would sigh and brush hair from my face. "You work too hard, sweetheart. You're too serious." It sounded like concern, but it wasn't admiration. It was a quiet dismissal, as if responsibility was just my natural state, not something worth celebrating. When Emma got her first car for her birthday, there were photos in the driveway, balloons, a cake. I told myself it made sense. She was older. Milestones mattered more at that age. When I got mine, I signed the paperwork myself. Monthly installments, my savings. Dad said he was proud of me. Then he added that he couldn't help with payments because Emma's bills were piling up again. There was always a reason. College came and I chose a state university an hour away. I majored in business, practical, stable, sensible. I thought maybe distance would rebalance something between us. It didn't. The phone calls followed me. "Your sister's rent is late," Mom would say, softly. "Could you help us this month?" Emma was going through a rough patch. It was always a rough patch, somehow lasting years. I said yes every time. Sometimes that meant skipping meals, stretching groceries, pretending I wasn't tired. I told myself it was temporary. I told myself family helped family. I didn't keep track of the total. I didn't want to know. When I came home during breaks, the house looked almost exactly the same, except for one thing. There was a wall filled with Emma's framed photos, school events, art projects, smiling snapshots with friends, certificates she had earned before eventually dropping out of her program because she needed to find herself. My photos weren't on that wall. They were in a drawer somewhere. I didn't ask about it. When Emma decided college wasn't for her anymore, my parents nodded like it was brave. Like stepping away from structure was a kind of courage. When I graduated and landed my first job, they clapped, they smiled, but they didn't come to the ceremony. It's just work, Dad said. We'll celebrate when your sister figures things out. I remember smiling in that moment. A small, controlled smile. As if it truly didn't matter. But it did. It wasn't one big betrayal, that's the thing. It was 100 tiny ones. Small comparisons, subtle assumptions, a constant message wrapped in gentle words. You'll be fine. You always are. It sounded like a compliment. It felt like a wall. Emma was expressive, emotional, needing. The world bent around her storms. My parents rushed to shield her from consequences, to soften every landing. If she struggled, it was a tragedy. If I struggled, it was a phase I would handle. Because I was capable. Because I didn't need as much. At least that's what they believed. I started visiting less often after I graduated. Partly because of work. Partly because sitting at that dinner table felt like watching a familiar play where I already knew my role. Emma would talk, Mom would glow, Dad would nod, and I would listen. Even when I spoke, it felt like background noise. The distance between us wasn't built overnight. It formed slowly, out of unspoken comparisons, out of financial transfers and quiet sacrifices, out of milestones that passed without applause. I never exploded. I never confronted anyone. I told myself this was just how families worked. One child louder, one steadier, one celebrated, one dependable. But dependability has a cost. Every time I sent money, every time I downplayed my own achievements, every time I swallowed the sting of being overlooked, something inside me adjusted. It learned not to expect fairness, not to expect recognition, not to expect more. By the time I entered adulthood fully, I had trained myself to be the stable one, the one who didn't need praise, the one who didn't ask for help, the one who could survive on less affection because at least I had competence. And maybe that was the real shift. I stopped asking. I stopped pointing out when something hurt. I stopped wondering why Emma's chaos required rescue while my effort required silence. Love in our family wasn't loud or violent. It was uneven, tilted slightly in one direction for so long that eventually it just felt normal. So I adapted. I became quieter, stronger, more self-contained. If Emma needed, she received. If I achieved, I handled it. Looking back now, I see it clearly. But back then, it just felt like life. Like gravity. Like something you don't question because it's always been there. And maybe that's why years later, when everything finally cracked open, I didn't scream. I had been practicing silence my whole life. A few months ago, after years of saving and saying yes to extra work, I finally signed the papers on something that was mine. A small house on the north side of Boulder. It wasn't grand, no sweeping staircase, no dramatic entryway, but the morning light poured through the windows in a way that made everything feel softer. The floors creaked gently instead of groaning. The yard was modest, but when the wind moved through it, the whole place seemed to breathe. I work in real estate. I've walked through hundreds of houses, some staged to perfection, others barely standing. I know market value. I know curb appeal. I know which details impress buyers and which ones are just cosmetic noise. This house wasn't flashy. It was solid. Good bones, quiet street, steady foundation. It felt like peace. When I held the keys for the first time, I didn't think about resale value or equity growth. I thought about my parents, about all the years they'd spent moving from one rental to another whenever the rent climbed too high, about how temporary had always been part of their lives. I wanted to give them something permanent, so I invited them to move in. I still remember the look on my mother's face when I told her. She blinked like she hadn't heard me correctly. Then her hands flew to her mouth and she started to cry. Not the polite kind, the full, trembling kind. "Natalie, are you serious?" Dad tried to protest at first, said it was too much, said I didn't owe them that. But I could see it in his eyes. He was proud. Proud in a way I hadn't seen before. Like he was finally looking at me not just as the dependable one, but as someone who had built something real. The first few weeks felt balanced. Mom filled the kitchen with the smell of coffee every morning. Dad spent hours in the yard, carefully tending to plants like he was restoring something fragile. I would come home from work and hear laughter drifting from the living room. It felt warm, full. For the first time in years, I thought maybe we had found a new rhythm. Maybe this was what it looked like when effort turned into harmony. Then Emma called. Her voice was thinner than I'd ever heard it, stripped of its usual brightness. She said the divorce had gone through. Her husband had left. There wasn't much money. The kids were confused. She didn't know what to do. I listened quietly, leaning against the kitchen counter while my mother hovered nearby, already anxious. "Could we stay with you?" Emma asked softly. "Just for a few weeks, until I figure things out." I looked around the room. The framed photos Mom had just hung. Dad's gardening gloves resting by the door. The house still smelled like fresh paint and new beginnings. Part of me hesitated, not because I didn't care, but because something inside me remembered patterns. Rough patches that lasted years, help that turned into expectation. Before I could think too long, Mom stepped closer. The moment she heard Emma's name, her face lit up in a way I hadn't seen in a long time. "We'll all be together again," she said, almost glowing. That sentence carried warmth, nostalgia, hope. And maybe a part of me wanted that too. So I said yes. Emma arrived the following weekend with 2 small suitcases. Eli clutched a stuffed dinosaur like it was armor. Nora held a pink blanket to her chest, wide-eyed and quiet. Mom rushed forward immediately, pulling them into hugs, already talking about hot chocolate and which room would be theirs. Emma thanked me. She looked tired, smaller somehow. For a moment I felt protective. This wasn't the confident sister from years ago. This was someone shaken. "It's just temporary," she assured me. I nodded. As she walked through the house, she paused in doorways, peered into closets, ran her hand across the kitchen counter. She smiled and said, "This place is perfect for the kid." I told myself that was gratitude. That's what it sounded like, at least. That evening, we all ate together at the dining table. The kids laughed when Dad pretended to spill water. Mom looked around the room like she had been handed the family she'd always imagined, everyone under one roof. I watched them. I wanted it to work. The house felt fuller now, louder, but still warm, still manageable. I told myself this was what generosity looked like. This was what love required sometimes. And in those early days, before anything shifted, before small boundaries began to blur, it almost felt right. Almost. At first, the changes were small enough to ignore. Emma moved a few things around in the kitchen, said it made more sense that way. She shifted the spice rack closer to the stove, reorganized the cabinets, laughed when I couldn't find the coffee mugs one morning, and told me I'd get used to it. I smiled. It was temporary, I reminded myself. Then the living room shifted. The couch, which had faced the window overlooking the yard, was turned toward the opposite wall. Better for movie nights with the kids, Emma explained. My wooden coffee table disappeared one afternoon, replaced with a lightweight plastic one covered in glitter stickers. Eli and Nora beamed at it like it was treasure. My bookshelf, carefully arranged, something I'd built myself, was moved to the garage. In its place stood a colorful play tent. The kids need space, Emma said gently, as if I'd suggested something unreasonable. Mom nodded. It feels livelier now. Livelier. I stood in the doorway, holding my bag, staring at a room that no longer looked like mine. The ivory walls I'd chosen suddenly felt like a backdrop for someone else's story. Every week, something else changed. The guest room became a full playroom. My office desk slowly turned into Emma's phone call station. Papers piled up where my laptop used to sit neatly. Craft supplies spread across the surface. If I needed to work from home, I waited until she was done. She started deciding which groceries we needed. Cartoons hummed in the background from morning until bedtime. Drawings were taped to the fridge with bright magnets. Laundry appeared in the hallway like permanent decor. One evening, I came home to a house full of unfamiliar voices. Emma had invited friends over for dinner. The kitchen was crowded, the air thick with perfume and laughter. Someone was stirring a pot on the stove I'd paid for. Another person was leaning against the counter, wine glass in hand. "Oh, Nat," Emma called casually when she saw me. "We're just having a little get-together." I stood there for a second too long, trying to decide what expression fit. Host, guest, intruder. The smell of food filled the house, but it didn't feel like mine. Mom was glowing. Dad looked content, watching the kids run between legs. It looked like a family gathering. It just didn't feel like my home anymore. The financial strain crept in quietly, too. Utilities climbed, groceries doubled, property taxes increased. I was still paying the mortgage alone. Every month, the number left my account with the same calm precision. One night, I finally said something. We were sitting at the dining table. The kids were asleep. The house, unusually quiet. I just wanted to talk about expenses, I began carefully. Property taxes went up this quarter, and the utilities have nearly doubled since. Mom's expression tightened before I finished. "You're being selfish, Natalie." The word landed heavier than I expected. "Your sister just went through a divorce," she continued. "And you're talking about money." I blinked, trying to understand how acknowledging numbers had become cruelty. Emma lowered her eyes, silent. A performance I'd seen before. Soft guilt, fragile posture. Dad adjusted his glasses, staring at the table. I felt the room shift again, subtly but decisively. I wasn't the homeowner explaining shared costs. I was the unkind daughter counting pennies while her sister suffered. "I'm still covering everything," I said, quietly. Mom sighed, disappointed. "It's still family's house. We all share it." That sentence echoed long after the conversation ended. Family's house. But my name was on every document. The next Sunday, I came home to the smell of fresh paint. Music was playing loudly from Emma's phone. The hallway walls, once a soft, neutral shade, were now mint green. Open paint cans sat on the floor. Drops splattered across the tile. Emma stood barefoot in one of my old t-shirts, humming. "The kids deserve color," she said, like this was obvious. "It feels happier." I stared at the wall, the brush strokes still wet. "You could have told me," I said. Mom appeared behind me, wiping her hands on a towel. "She's right, honey. A little color doesn't hurt anyone." The words rose in my throat. It's my house. You can't just repaint without asking. But they stayed there, because suddenly I was tired of sounding territorial, defensive. Like I needed to prove something in a space that should have already been mine. So I stepped around the paint cans and went to my room. That's when the shrinking began. Not physically, not dramatically, just slowly. I started staying late at work, volunteering for extra showings, taking calls that could have waited, eating dinner at my desk instead of at the dining table. When I did come home, I moved carefully, quietly, as if making too much noise might disrupt something delicate. Emma's laughter filled the evenings. The kids' cartoons blended into a steady soundtrack. Mom looked younger than she had in years, surrounded by grandchildren. Dad seemed softer. They were happy. I was disappearing. The living room no longer reflected me. The hallway didn't either. Even the kitchen felt foreign, bright magnets, pastel containers, unfamiliar routines. 3 months passed like that. 3 months of watching my own house evolve into something that required no input from me. 3 months of paying for a space where my opinion had become optional. Then, one evening in early spring, Mom asked me to sit down in the living room. Her tone was formal, careful. Dad sat beside her, hands folded neatly. Emma was on the couch sorting papers, though she wasn't really looking at them. The clock ticked loudly on the wall. Mom cleared her throat. "We've been thinking, sweetheart." That word sweetheart felt rehearsed. "Emma needs stability for the kids," she continued. "And you're young, independent. You can manage on your own." I felt my fingers tighten around the arm of the chair. "Maybe it's time," she said gently, "for you to rent a place closer to your office." The air went very still. I looked at them, really looked. There was no hesitation in their faces, no apology, just quiet certainty, as if they were suggesting something practical, logical, as if I were the temporary one. "My name is on the deed," I wanted to say. "I pay the mortgage. I built this." But the words felt heavy, useless. Emma didn't look up. Dad avoided my eyes. Mom's expression held something close to pity. For a long moment, the only sound was the clock ticking. It wasn't loud. It wasn't explosive. It was suffocating. Because in that silence, I understood something clearly. They had already decided. I wasn't being asked. I was being moved. And the strange thing was I didn't cry. I didn't argue. I stood. Slowly walked down the hallway, mint green and unfamiliar, and closed the door to my room. For the first time, the house felt entirely foreign. Not because the furniture had changed, but because I had. Somewhere along the way, in trying to keep peace, I had allowed myself to become a guest in the one place I owned. And now they were gently, reasonably, lovingly suggesting I leave. Because Emma needed stability, and I apparently did not. I didn't argue. That's the part people expect to be louder, dramatic, a slammed door, a list of receipts thrown onto the table, but I didn't give them any of that. After the conversation in the living room, the gentle suggestion that I, the homeowner, should consider renting somewhere else, I simply stood up and went to my room. I folded my clothes carefully. Not all of them, just enough to fit into a suitcase. The house hummed with distant laughter. Emma's voice drifted down the hallway. A cartoon played in the background. It sounded warm, ordinary. I zipped the suitcase slowly. Something inside me had gone very still. A week later, they left for Florida. Emma had been planning that trip for months. The kids were ecstatic. My parents insisted she deserved a break. The morning they drove away, the driveway felt strangely quiet once the car disappeared. I stood there for a moment after the engine noise faded. For the first time in months, the house was silent. I walked back inside and closed the door gently behind me. The mint green hallway stretched ahead. Toys scattered across the living room floor. The pastel walls caught the morning light. I moved from room to room, slowly running my fingers across surfaces that no longer reflected me. The couch still faced the opposite wall. The plastic glittered coffee table sat proudly in the center. My bookshelf remained in the garage, dusty and displaced. The air carried a faint trace of Emma's perfume and vanilla candles. It should have felt lonely. It didn't. It felt clear. There was no anger rising in my chest. No dramatic realization, just a simple understanding settling into place. They had made their choice. Now I would make mine. The next morning, I met with a lawyer downtown. Her office was lined with framed degrees and smelled faintly of strong coffee. I sat across from her and placed a folder on the desk property deed mortgage records. Every receipt with my name printed clearly across the top. I explained everything calmly. No embellishment, no emotional language, just facts. She read through the documents, carefully nodding once or twice. Finally, she looked up at me. Legally, she said, "You are the sole owner, Miss Brooks. No one can remove you without your consent." The sentence felt like oxygen. Not because I doubted it, but because hearing it out loud confirmed what I already knew deep down. This wasn't about revenge. It was about ownership, about the simple truth that what I had built was mine. I left her office with a plan forming quietly in my mind. That afternoon, I contacted an appraiser. He arrived the next morning with a clipboard and a professional detachment that I appreciated. He walked through the house, methodically measuring, noting upgrades I had made before everything changed. "Good bones," he said. "Excellent neighborhood." I almost smiled at that. I had known that from the beginning. When he handed me the estimate, I recognized the number immediately. I'd run the projections myself months earlier, back when the house still felt like a sanctuary. I sat in my car afterward for a long time, hands resting on the steering wheel, breathing evenly. This wasn't impulsive. This wasn't emotional. It was clean. Within an hour, the house was listed for sale. No dramatic announcement. No warning email, just paperwork. 2 days later, I met Callum Warren. He was a civil engineer who had recently transferred to Boulder for a new project. Calm, well-spoken. The kind of presence that didn't fill a room aggressively but steadied it. When he stepped into the living room, he paused. "It's rare to find a place this well kept," he said. I almost laughed at the irony, thinking of the chaos that had lived there only days before. We walked through each room together. He asked thoughtful questions. Not once did he criticize the paint colors or the rearranged furniture. He looked past it. When we reached the window overlooking the garden, he stood quietly for a moment. "This feels like a home someone loved," he said. The words landed gently, because he was right. I had loved it, even when it stopped loving me back. By Friday, we were sitting in my lawyer's office again. The paperwork was prepared, neatly stacked in precise order. I read every page carefully. When I signed my name, my hand didn't shake. The ink dried clean and dark against the paper. That signature had once symbolized hope. Now it symbolized something else. Freedom. Callum signed next. He offered a faint smile. "I'll take good care of it," he said. I believed him. There was no bitterness in me as the final copies were exchanged. No secret satisfaction. Just a steady exhale, like setting down a weight I'd been carrying for years. That evening, I stood outside the house one last time. The sun dipped behind the Rockies, casting a soft gold across the windows. For a moment, I remembered the day I'd first held the keys. The excitement, the quiet pride, the image of my parents finally having something stable. The irony wasn't sharp, it was almost poetic. I took a single photo. Not for nostalgia, just as proof that endings can be quiet too. Back in my car, I opened my laptop and typed a short email to our shared family inbox. Ownership transfer completed. No explanations. No apologies. I closed the computer and placed it gently on the passenger seat. Then I drove out of Boulder, past the familiar streets, past the coffee shop I used to stop at on Sunday mornings. The mountains faded slowly in my rearview mirror. I didn't know exactly where I was heading yet, only that I wasn't running. I was choosing. People like to imagine revenge as loud, explosive, full of sharp words and slammed doors. This wasn't that. This was paperwork. This was law. This was reclaiming something that had always belonged to me. And for the first time in a long while, my silence wasn't surrender. It was control. 1 week later, they came back from Florida. I wasn't there, but I could picture it with unsettling clarity. The car pulling into the driveway just before sunset. Sand still clinging to the tires. The kids half asleep from the flight, cranky and sunburned. My mother stretching her arms, saying how good it felt to be home. Home. Emma would have stepped out first, sunglasses pushed into her hair, phone in hand, calling to Eli and Nora to grab their bags. My father would follow slower, carrying suitcases, familiar routine, familiar porch, familiar key in Emma's hand. Except it wasn't familiar anymore. She slid the key into the lock. It turned too easily. No resistance, no hesitation. The door opened. The first thing they noticed wasn't furniture. It wasn't missing boxes. It was the smell of coffee. Fresh, strong, drifting from the kitchen like a quiet announcement. The light was on inside. That's when confusion would have flickered across their faces. They stepped into the living room, the same pastel walls, the same rearranged furniture. Nothing dramatic, nothing overturned, just occupied. In the kitchen, Callum Warren stood with a mug in his hand. He told me later he had just poured his second cup when he heard the key scrape against the lock. He assumed it was a neighbor, or maybe the previous owner returning for something forgotten. He turned, and there they were, a woman, 2 children, an older couple, staring at him like he was an intruder. Emma reacted first. "What are you doing in my house?" she demanded. Callum stayed calm. He said he almost felt sorry for them in that moment. He set his mug down slowly. "I'm sorry," he replied evenly. "I think there's been a misunderstanding. I'm the new owner." The word landed. Owner. Emma's face drained of color. She took a step backward, then another. Her mouth opened like she was about to argue, but no words came out. And then she fainted, collapsed right there in the kitchen. The kids started crying. My mother gasped. My father rushed forward, kneeling beside Emma, calling her name. Chaos. Callum told me he stepped back instinctively, giving them space. He offered water, helped move a chair, kept his voice steady. 5 minutes later, my phone rang. My father. I let it ring once before answering. "There's a man in your house," he said, his voice shaking between disbelief and anger. "He says he owns it." I didn't raise my voice. I didn't rush to explain. "That's because he does," I said. Silence. Heavy, disoriented silence. Then my mother's voice, broken, high, and frantic. "How could you do this to your sister? She has children. I closed my eyes for a moment, took a slow breath. I didn't do anything to her, I said carefully. I just stopped doing everything for her. The line went quiet again. There were no insults thrown at me, no dramatic threats. Just shock, thick and paralyzing. Before they could respond, I ended the call. Later that evening, Callum phoned to tell me the rest. Emma regained consciousness, disoriented and furious. My parents sat stiffly on the couch as if the room itself had betrayed them. The kids clung to my mother's side, confused. Callum explained everything politely. The sale had gone through legally. The deed had been transferred. All documentation was processed through proper channels. He wasn't trespassing. He even told me he apologized for the inconvenience. As if their world hadn't just tilted. An hour later, an envelope slid through the front door. Inside was the official notice from my lawyer. 14 days to remove their belongings. I had insisted on that time frame. Not overnight. Not immediate eviction. Enough time to pack. Enough time to absorb what had happened. Not cruelty. Consequence. For years, my parents had defended Emma's carelessness, covered her debts, smoothed over her decisions, called it love. I had believed that too, until I realized that love without respect slowly turns into obligation. They had watched me build that house brick by brick, payment by payment. They had seen the overtime hours, the discipline, the sacrifice, and still the moment Emma needed something, they treated it like it was hers by default. The moment they told me to leave my own house, they made their choice. I simply made mine. That night after the notice was delivered, my phone stayed mostly silent. No long strings of accusations, no apologies either, just quiet. I didn't feel triumph. I didn't feel revenge. I felt steady. They weren't being punished. They were facing the natural result of believing that my boundaries were negotiable. 14 days. Time enough to pack. Time enough to understand that ownership, real ownership, cannot be erased by suggestion. And for the first time in my life, my silence wasn't surrender. It was final. Natalie did not go far. She moved to Denver. The apartment was small, one-bedroom, third-floor windows that looked out over a quiet stretch of brick buildings and trees. It didn't have the wide kitchen she once loved, or the sunlit floors she had refinished herself. It didn't carry the echo of childhood laughter or the weight of family expectations. It carried only her. The first night there, she unpacked slowly. A kettle, 2 plates, her laptop, a framed photo of the kids she couldn't quite put away. Silence settled differently here. It wasn't the suffocating quiet of a house where she felt erased. It was clean, intentional. When she turned the key in the door, she knew everything inside belonged because she chose it. Work shifted too. She stepped back from the firm and began taking on freelance design projects, quiet consultations, staging advice, small renovation plans. She understood homes. She understood value. But now she was learning something else she understood. Space. Emotional space. Financial space. The architecture of boundaries. She worked at her dining table with morning light across her keyboard. No one rearranged her chair. No one painted over her walls. No one dismissed her when she spoke about money. Her parents called less often. When they did, the conversations were careful and brief. Weather updates, health check-ins, polite exchanges that skimmed the surface. They never apologized outright. They never acknowledged the sentence that had cut deepest. Emma needs stability. Natalie no longer argued. She no longer explained. Love without respect, she had learned, is just obligation dressed up as family. Emma's world shifted, more dramatically. A few months after the move, she lost her job. Budget cuts, she said. Office restructuring. Natalie didn't press for details. She heard the strain in her sister's voice, sharp edges where confidence once lived. There was no gloating in Natalie's chest, no satisfaction, only distance. Emma never said she was wrong, but she no longer said Natalie was selfish either. The kids were the only bridge Natalie kept intact. She mailed birthday cards each year, handwritten, never late. Inside, she tucked small bookstore gift cards and notes that said, "I'm proud of you. Keep drawing. Keep asking questions." She didn't sign them with explanations. She signed them with love. Because boundaries, she had learned, are not walls. They are doors. You decide who walks through. You decide when to close them. One evening, months after the chaos had settled into memory, Natalie received an email from Callum Warren. Subject line: house update. She stared at it for a long moment before opening it. He wrote simply, "The garden was thriving. The kitchen window caught morning light just like she'd said it would. He'd kept the oak shelves. His mother loved the reading nook." And at the end, one line, "It's a happy house. You built something good here." Natalie read that sentence twice. A happy house. She hadn't burned it down. She hadn't destroyed it in anger. She had passed it on with clarity. The walls still held warmth. The floors still carried light. The difference was that she no longer carried the weight of keeping everyone else steady inside it. She closed her laptop and stepped onto her small balcony. The Denver air was cooler than Boulder's, thinner, honest. For years, she believed love meant sacrifice without limit, that being the stable one meant absorbing the impact, that saying no meant failing as a daughter, as a sister. Now she understood something quieter and stronger. You cannot build a life where you are constantly shrinking. You cannot call it love if respect is missing. And stability, real stability, cannot be taken from someone who knows how to stand alone. She still loved her family, but she loved herself enough to stop doing everything for her sister. The peace she felt wasn't loud. It didn't arrive with applause or vindication. It arrived in small rituals, locking her own door, budgeting her own money, choosing her own paint colors. Freedom, she realized, isn't dramatic, it's deliberate. And in the quiet apartment in Denver, with her work spread neatly across the table and the city humming gently, below, Natalie finally understood. Boundaries are not punishments. They are permissions. They are the doorway you build when you decide you deserve to live inside your own life. Sometimes the bravest thing you can do is step back from the people you love and choose peace anyway. Endless sacrifice isn't noble if it costs you your sense of self. It isn't selfish to protect your stability, it's honest. I wonder, what would you have done in her place? If this story stayed with you, let me know your thoughts. And stay a while. Some lessons are softer when we